Mr. President, I had the opportunity this morning to catch CNBC program involving that had Mr. Jack Welch, former CEO of GE, on, and I thought he made a number of valuable points. He's very, very worried about our economy. He believes that we are facing serious troubles, and then we need to take action to do something about it. But as a corporate leader of great renown, one of the more respected corporate leaders, I guess, in America at this time, and he evidenced a real frustration at the lack of leadership this administration is showing with regard to our financial crisis. And he said a number of things. One of them was classic leadership, classic thought by a manager, a man who's managed a very large corporation worldwide with many, many, many moving parts. And he said that you have to have a strategy, and we have no strategy. And I think that's correct. I don't believe the American people sense that this country is able to articulate a serious strategy to confront the difficulties with which we are dealing now. And he said you should basically, and it's, I guess, CEO language, good manager language, he said that everything needs to go through a screen. And in his opinion, the screen should be what our strategy is, and our strategy should be, in general, as I recall his words, to create an economy that's productive, innovative, and growing, creating jobs, creating wealth, creating prosperity. And everything ought to be judged by that. One of the points he mentioned was drilling for oil and gas in America. So we've got all kinds of government agencies out here, all kinds of regulations and a permitorium blocking of the giving of permits that has substantially reduced the ability of this nation to produce oil and gas at home, a critical factor if we're going to be competitive and economically prosperous. We need to quit buying so much abroad, sending that wealth abroad and keep it at home. So he just threw that out as one of the things that would never get through a screen, would it? Because instead of helping this country be more prosperous, create jobs, growth, it does just the opposite. Yet, in the midst of this massive government entity that we have these contradictory actions going on. And as a result, we are muddling along at a very unhealthy rate. And the American people are worried about it. Last week completed the 6th consecutive week that the stock market fell. Oh, we were told, you know, in January when things were making some progress, that everything was just doing great. We are creating a lot of jobs. We're creating jobs, and the market was going along better, but it's not moving very well. And if you read the financial pages, the people who spend their life dealing with the economy and the threats that we face are uneasy about our future. Just read those articles. The round table of worldwide economic experts and barons over the weekend just came out was very troubling to me. Many of them had very serious concerns about the future. Would we have a double dip? Some seem to say yes. And President, presiding officer on the Budget Committee, Senator Coons, knows the numbers we're dealing with and the testimony we've had that indicates that Mr. Bowles, former Chief of Staff to President Clinton, and Alan Simpson in their Fiscal Commission report said that we are facing the most predictable crisis in our history and that it could cause an economic difficulties for us soon. Mr. Bowles said 2 years, give or take. not our grandchildren, but soon. And this is why the experts are concerned. So we've got a problem. I don't believe we have in the White House any call to the kind of action necessary to alter the debt trajectory we're on, which is unsustainable. I don't think the American people fully understand, but they understand enough to punish the Congress in this last election. I'm afraid they're going to punish us again because no Congress can defend itself from the criticism that you have presided members of Congress over a government that is borrowing 40 cents of every dollar you spend, that spends $3,700 billion and takes in only $2,200 billion, and we just borrow the rest. And we're on a path that doesn't alter that. And the President's budget, the most irresponsible ever submitted, made our debt path worse rather than better. So I'm worried about it. So the Majority Leader announces that, well, it'd be foolish to have a budget. Senator Reid said it would be foolish to have a budget at a time when we've never had a greater fiscal threat to the integrity of our economic system than we have today. Let me repeat that. We have never been in a position in which the economy could do as much harm to our nation as it can today. We're heading to the wall at warp speed. It is a dangerous circumstance. And we can get off this path, and we've got to do some things that are not very pleasant, but not impossible, that are being done by mayors and county commissioners and governors all over America and countries around the world. The British made some very substantial cuts, far more than we're discussing in their overall spending program, and some people have pushed back. And they said, you're cutting too much. You know how that debate will happen here if we cut spending here. And the International Monetary Fund, certainly no bastion of conservative economic thought, said, no, UK, no, Brits, stay the course. Don't weaken now. You've set a good, tough path for containing spending and reducing spending, and you've got plans that, if you stay the course, will be more successful than giving them up and quitting under some pressure that you might be under today. So how do you get there? How do we get to the point where we deal with these issues? Harvard economist Alberto Alesina, drawing from his and other research on large fiscal adjustments across multiple nations, said this, quote, spending cuts are far more effective than tax increases in stabilizing the debt and avoiding economic downturns. In fact, in several episodes, spending cuts adopted to reduce deficits have been associated with government expansions rather than recessions, close quote. Goldman Sachs has also done a study that indicates that. And we have empirical evidence of countries that have taken firm steps to get the financial house in order, have found that maybe almost to their surprise, they've had economic growth quicker than many have projected. So where are we today? Apparently we're not going to have any kind of regular budget process in the Senate, to my great disappointment. I believe Senator Conrad, the chairman of the Budget Committee, I'm the ranking Republican on that committee, was prepared to have hearings, but the Democratic leadership has decided not to. The senators can't call on Budget Committee meeting. Only the chairman and the leaders can do those kind of things. They've decided not to. Under the Budget Act, we should have had hearings by April 1st of this year, and the law that we have that mandates the passage and a movement of a budget in Congress says it should be passed by April 15th. We're now getting close to July 4th. Now, we've had no real public discussion, no national debate as part of a marking up of a budget about the challenges this nation faces. We had, well, first we had the Gang of Six, and they had been meeting in secret, and I don't know who were advising them. I don't think many of the average American people in their struggling who maybe have lost their jobs or haven't seen their pay increased or seen their overtime be eliminated. Many of those people were in the room with them, but they were working. And they're good people. I was kind of getting anxious for a month or so to hear something from them. Maybe it would be a good deal. Maybe it would be something to get us moving. I don't know. I had my doubts about it, and I expressed that, but I expressed my support to see what they could produce. Maybe it will be worthwhile. I'm withholding judgment. So now we're not hearing from them, although they apparently have enough work product, maybe even a plan that they met with 10 other senators, I understand, to discuss what they're planning on. Hadn't let anybody else in on the deal. But now so we don't worry about the Gang of Six. If that doesn't work, we've got the Vice President. President Obama has asked him to have meetings with a very small group of Senate and House leaders, and that they're going to write us a budget. And there's some good people meeting in that. I don't have any doubt. But weeks have gone by. We had a week recess, and apparently it was over 2 weeks, and it didn't even meet. The president's traveling around the world making speeches, raising money. And this country has not had a budget in 775 days. This Senate has not passed a budget in 775 days. And the Budget Act requires us to pass a budget. It can't be filibustered. It can be passed with a simple majority. If it's going to be a partisan effort, sometimes they are just purely a partisan vote. There are 53 Democratic senators here that ought to be able to pass a budget. We passed budgets when the Republicans had a one-vote majority. Sometimes you can get a bipartisan agreement on a budget. That's the best thing. Sometimes it's just done with a simple majority. So we had the potential to do that, but oh no. So now weeks are going by, and we're waiting on this meetings in the White House. Nobody knows what's particularly happening there. It's supposed to be secret. Normally your budget is brought up. It's brought before the Budget Committee. The chairman lays down the chairman's mark. Everybody gets to offer complete substitutes, gets to offer their whole budget or technical amendments or significant amendments to that budget, and they get voted on. And the matter is discussed, and the American people can get a copy of the chairman's mark and the amendments offered by the other members of the committee. And this is how you do business in a democracy, last I heard. And then we're accountable, right? How much did you think we ought to raise taxes on the American people? How much did you think you're going to cut spending? Well, you going to dare to make any change in Medicare? I'll not vote for you if you make any change in Medicare. Or you've got to do something about these entitlements. You didn't do anything about the Medicare and entitlements. You're going to let them go broke? Those are the kinds of good discussions you would be having there. And American people could see it, and then it comes to the floor of the Senate. Likewise, it has an expedited process, but a real opportunity to have amendments, even hundreds of amendments, to offer to the Budget Act and you then have something that at least the American people will know what's in it, and at least they'll know what their representatives voted for or against. But I think this idea of doing it in some other order, not the regular order, is an unhealthy process, and I hope that we can do better. So I would just conclude, Mr. President, by saying at 775 days, I don't believe we've fulfilled our responsibility. We obviously have not fulfilled our statutory responsibility under the Budget Act, which says we should have a budget by April 15th. It also says we should have commenced hearings April 1st. Oh, well, it's tough business, you know, standing before the American people and actually, in this crisis we're in, proposing the kind of severe actions that are going to be necessary to put our country on the right path, not the path to decline, not the path to debt crisis, but the path to prosperity. It's going to take some efforts. It's going to be painful in some ways. We're not moving in that direction at all. But what about the House of Representatives? They passed a budget. They passed a bold budget, a budget that goes 10 years and then even further. And it laid out a plan that was historic. It confronted the growth in entitlements, which are threatening the viability of those programs. It dealt with economic growth. It dealt with reducing spending, which has surged in the last several years. Indeed, in the last 2 cycles, we've increased non-defense discretionary spending 25%. People act like you can't, if you cut spending, we're going to sink into the ocean. Well, that could be eliminated, and we would be no worse off than we were just 3 years ago. So the House did their duty, and what happened? A Democratic leader over here, instead of producing his budget, he calls up the House budget, and he wants to talk about how horrible it is, and voted on it. It got quite a number of votes for it in the Senate. Certainly not enough to pass, but he got a lot of votes. So I offered the President's budget, the one he submitted a couple of months ago, that I call the most irresponsible budget ever to be presented to this nation. And I stand by that. We are in a systemic crisis that's got to be confronted with serious decision-making, and that budget came nowhere close to it. So I offered that. It failed 97-0. Not one member of this Senate, Republican or Democrat, voted for that budget. So I just think this is irresponsible. 775 days gone. We didn't have a budget last year. We didn't pass a single appropriations bill last year. Everything was cobbled together in this monumental CR that you heard about, continuing resolution. Totally ineffective as a method to govern in this country and to spend money. Congress ought to do its 13 appropriation bills promptly every year. First, they should have a budget that tells all the committees how much money they've got to spend. Then they should pass their 13 appropriations bills. Each one should be brought up, subject to amendment, and be voted on. So we've been in this very irresponsible circumstance. So my request is to our colleagues that are working either in the White House with the Vice President and whatever they're doing over there, the gang of 6 or 5 or whatever they're doing, how about getting busy? How about us seeing some numbers so we can go to work? I don't think it's going to be well received by members of the Senate to have plopped down in our lap on the eve of some important matter such as the debt ceiling a budget proposal that nobody's had a chance to study, and the American people don't know what's in it. I thought that was one of the things we learned in the last election. I thought we learned that the American people want transparency. They want accountability. They want to know what their representatives are doing, and they want to see them in the light of day, not the dark of night, doing their work. I think that's reasonable. That's the way our Congress was set up to work. That's what I'd like to see. So I think it's time for these meetings to start getting over with. I think it's time for us to start seeing some numbers. What are they going to do? Wait for the last possible day to raise the debt ceiling and then waltz in here with some sort of agreement and we're all supposed to rubber stamp in a state of panic? I don't appreciate that. I don't think the American people will. It's not good government. They've got a plan. Let's go on and let's start seeing what it is. Let's bring it up and let's start having some public discussion and vote on it. I think that's the right way to go about our business, and I'm very concerned that we've gotten away from the regular order. I believe we've gotten away from the understanding of our august responsibility to pass a budget, to decide openly and publicly how much we think we can spend, how much we're going to tax, how much debt we're going to have. And we ought to do that publicly and openly, and I believe that would be healthy for our republic and help the American people to understand just how deep a hole we are in. It's far deeper than most of us realize. I've looked at the numbers. They are very grim indeed, and we need to get started sooner rather than later. I thank the President would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
senator from.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm pleased to join with Senators Coburn and Feinstein in offering an amendment to repeal the ethanol excise tax credit and the ethanol import tariff. These policies are fiscally irresponsible, environmentally unwise, and economically indefensible. Historically, Mr. President, our government has helped a product compete in one of three ways. Either we subsidize it, we protect it from competition, or we require its use. Right now, ethanol may be the only product receiving all three forms of support. The ethanol tax break is extraordinarily expensive. The Government Accountability Office has found that the tax credit costs American taxpayers a staggering $6 billion annually. This is quite a sum to prop up a fuel that is causing land conversion for corn production, commodity and food prices to rise, and is barely putting a dent into our nation's dependence on foreign oil. With our amendment, which has an effective date of July 1st, we have the opportunity to immediately save American taxpayers nearly $3 billion in just the 6 months remaining in this fiscal year. Mr. President, the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act requires the production of at least 36 billion gallons of biofuels in 2022, up from the original 2005 Energy Policy Act, which required 7.5 billion gallons by 2012. Collectively, the first-generation biofuels industry will receive tens of billions in unnecessary subsidies through the year 2022. If the current subsidy were allowed to continue for 5 years, the Federal Treasury would pay oil companies at least $31 billion to use 69 billion gallons of corn-based ethanol that the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard already requires them to use. We simply cannot afford to pay the oil industry for following the law. The data overwhelmingly demonstrate that the costs of the current ethanol subsidies and tariffs far outweigh their benefits. The Center for Agricultural and Rural Development at Iowa State University estimated that a 1-year extension of the ethanol subsidy and tariff would lead to only 427 additional direct domestic jobs at a cost of almost $6 billion. That's roughly $14 million of taxpayer money per job. While expanding our capacity to generate alternative domestic fuel sources is an important step toward becoming less dependent on foreign oil, I have serious concerns about the effects of increased ethanol use. There are other alternative sources of energy that make far more sense. The energy, agricultural, and automotive sectors are already struggling to adapt to the existing ethanol mandates. I'm disappointed that the Environmental Protection Agency has issued a partial waiver for the use of E15, a blend of gasoline containing 15% ethanol. Many residents in my state have already experienced difficulties using gasoline blended with 10% ethanol, finding that it causes problems in older cars, snowmobiles, boats, lawnmowers, and off-the-road vehicles. The EPA's E15 waiver fails to adequately protect against misfueling and will add unnecessary confusion at the gas pump for consumers. We simply cannot place so many engines in jeopardy. These first-generation biofuel mandates also present environmental concerns, as they could result in energy efficiency losses and increased emissions of air pollutants because the mechanical failures can jeopardize the effectiveness of emission control devices and systems installed on engines. In addition, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, over recent years, we have seen food and feed prices increase as crops have been diverted to first-generation biofuel production. I think of it this way. We should be raising crops for food, not for fuel. Senate Homeland Security Committee Chairman Joe Lieberman and I held a series of hearings in 2008 that examined the impact of corn-based ethanol on food prices, and we found that it certainly had had a negative impact. For one thing, crops that had been grown to support other grains were being diverted to produce corn. That land was being switched to corn production. But that corn was no longer available for products that use corn for food, but instead was being diverted to the production of ethanol. The bottom line, Mr. President, is that we can no longer ignore the cost of this policy to our nation and its taxpayers, particularly given our current fiscal crisis. At a time when we're projecting a deficit of this year alone of $1.5 trillion, why in the world are we spending $6 billion subsidizing ethanol? Subsidizing the blending of corn-based ethanol into gasoline is simply fiscally indefensible. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the Coburn-Feinstein amendment to repeal the ethanol excise tax credit and to eliminate the ethanol import tariff. Thank you, Mr. President.
President. The Senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, in 1964, President Johnson envisioned an America that, quote, rests on abundance and liberty for all. It was against LBJ's backdrop of a great society that we reignited a tradition of community. This little spillover of the 1960s and our flight to the moon and all of that, but the nation somehow came together, and we sensed that we were a community, that we had a mutual obligation to each other. And that is, at the very least, I think, characteristic of the American people, more then than now. Programs like VISTA, Peace Corps, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid were born in those few years, 61 through 64. Sadly, nearly 50 years after LBJ's war on poverty, we have witnessed vicious attempts to roll back government programs designed to give low-income Americans a hand up in life. I don't mean just low-income Americans, but disabled Americans, very poor senior Americans who qualify for both Medicare and Medicaid, such a difficult journey they have. What we want to do is not to give people a hand up, but simply to be a safety net. That's what he said this country owed its people. That's true about defense, and that's true about social policy. We have a responsibility, all of us, to do that, to make sure nobody is utterly left out. There's no question that we must reduce our deficit, and I have a whole series of ways that can be done in abundance. But we should not do so on the backs of working families still struggling under the weight of this recession. Oh, yes, we're in a recession. So that everything that was true about people that were having a hard time before is a lot truer now. And yet, bill after bill proposed by Republicans seeks to do just exactly that. The House Republican H.R. number 1 was a direct attack on America's working families and the successful education, job training, and community development programs designed to combat poverty. And the Republican budget proposal for next year goes even further. It attacks Medicare and Medicaid, the health programs that over 100 million American people rely on. Some more than others, but all have to have that as a safety net. At a critical moment in our economic recovery, Republicans are more focused on settling old scores, evidently, from health care reform and the bitterness of that fight than they are on creating jobs or protecting people. Mr. President, the Republican plan for getting our deficit under control amounts to an upside-down government. Instead of helping those who depend on government programs to support their families, the Republican plan would guarantee that millionaires, billionaires, and large corporations continue to receive trillions of dollars, to wit, $4 trillion under the new budget, in government subsidies that will grow exponentially over time and substantially increase our benefit. They will do very, very well indeed were we to make the tragic mistake of accepting that. So Republicans are not for a fair or balanced approach to deficit reduction. And it's a great mystery to me. It's a quandary to me. I mean, it can be, you can say it's theological or whatever. You can make up all kinds of nasty political views of it. But nevertheless, that's what it is. What they are there for is a government that only exists to support big business and wealthy Americans, kind of a perpetual tarp for their friends. Well, I reject that notion, and the American people do too. In my estimation, there is no government program that more fully embodies our nation's tradition of community than Medicaid, our sense of mutual obligation. Some people are born wealthy, some people are born very poor, some people are born in between, some people are born wealthy then become poor, some people are born poor then become wealthy. But while they're down, they have a safety net, and it is called Medicaid. You don't hear people talking about it very much, particularly, frankly, somewhat disappointingly, from my side of the aisle. After almost 50 years, Medicaid is still a life-saving part of what we do as a government, what we're meant to do as a government. Medicaid is simply too important to millions of people. Nationally, there were 68 million people enrolled in Medicaid in 2010. 68 million children, seniors, people with disabilities, pregnant women. These are families who are living on the edge and barely making it. They now have a safety net, more efficient than any private insurance program in existence. They have that. In West Virginia, there were over 402,000 people enrolled in 2008. 150 of those aged and disabled. and 191,000 children. Children. So almost 50 years ago, Medicaid is still a life-saving part of our nation's health care system. In West Virginia, Medicaid covers 40% of all births. In the United States of America, Medicaid pays for in West Virginia, it's 50% of all births are covered by Medicaid. That tells you something. In our country, 40% of all births are taken care of by Medicaid. That says a lot. 62% of long-term care is Medicaid, and along with that, the Children's Health Insurance Program. There were a lot of people who fought really hard over a number of years to get the Children's Health Insurance Program that would insure more children who were not, at that point, eligible. Well, they're still getting it, but the House wants to get rid of that program altogether. That's 34% of the children in our country. Medicaid provides an essential lifeline to families during difficult economic times when people lose jobs that have been provided them that have health insurance. Medicaid is the health care program that helps states during crises, not just people, but states, including after the, obviously, September 11th attack, Hurricane Katrina, Rita, the recent floods and tornadoes in the South and the Midwest, all being helped by Medicaid. Medicaid is part of the fabric of our great nation. And to be clear at this point, I need to say that the House bill that was passed by the House, and who voted for it and who didn't, obviously, is very much on record, would devastate Medicaid and government in general out of discretionary spending. Anyway, people who are covered by Medicaid do matter. They are people, their families, they have their needs, their wants, their ambitions, their dreams, their sadnesses, their depressions, whatever. Darren Hale from Princeton, West Virginia, wrote me, I'm a disabled West Virginian whose family relies on Medicare and Medicaid. That may be a dual eligible, poor enough to be on Medicaid, old enough to be on Medicare, not able to survive simply on just one or the other. I hope and pray that these health care programs won't be ended or totally changed. Please do not support Republican changes to these programs as a way of cutting costs to the taxpayer. The poor of West Virginia and elsewhere should not and cannot bear the burden of the deficit reduction that Republicans want. We need to think very seriously, Mr. President, about our priorities. That's what this conversation really leads me to. Let's say I'm a 10-year-old boy, and I'm being brought up in West Virginia. My means are meager, and I step out into a road and am hit by a car. I don't die, but perhaps my spine is fractured, probably, several legs broken, and I am condemned to a life in the wheelchair for the rest of my life. Now, that child is not protected by private enterprise system. That child, unless it's an unusual child from a fairly wealthy family, who then can provide insurance, but they will spend themselves down with that insurance being so incredibly important that they will eventually qualify for Medicaid. When you're hit by a car, that's not something that you plan on. It's not something that you failed to do because you didn't have a work ethic or whatever the common wisdom would be about that. It's just something that happened. But the fact remains your health care is cut. Your life is changed, and it grows more miserable because you have nothing in the way of a safety net if the Republican budget is passed, if we get too aggressive about cutting Medicaid. Mr. President, I'm troubled that members of Congress and senior advocates have rightfully rallied in staunch defense. You can find wonderful groups here in Washington who rise up in anger when people talk about cutting Medicaid. They're for Medicaid. They know what it does. They know what it was intended to do. They know what it does, and they know what difference it makes. But aside from an occasional editorial or story, there has been an unsettling silence about Medicaid, even from members of my own party. This is despite the fact that the 5 main arguments made in support of Medicare, which seem to have a rebirth recently, are also true of Medicaid. 1, the public strongly supports Medicaid, just as they do Medicare. 60% of the people say that they would prefer to keep Medicaid as it is now. That surprises me. I would have thought the figure would have been much lower. And I'll get into that in a moment. 2, Medicaid also creates jobs, unlike tax cuts for oil companies and rich people, et cetera. Every $1 million in federal Medicaid spending results in 17.1 new jobs. Sounds boring? Maybe it is, but not to the people who get those jobs. That's at hospitals, that's at nursing homes, community health centers, and doctor's offices, because that's what Medicaid covers. 4, a Medicaid block grant or a spending cap, which is proposed by some. The cap is proposed by some to get away from the word block grant. But the effect, don't be fooled by that, the effect is the same. They would both reduce the Medicaid benefits and increase cost sharings for seniors, for all of the recipients on Medicaid, from day one. Understand that clearly, I would say to my colleagues. Much has been said about a Medicare voucher system, but capping Medicaid spending would be just as bad for the 5.5 million seniors and 11 million individuals with disabilities enrolled in Medicaid. 5, instead of reducing the deficit, the savings achieved by drastically cutting Medicaid would also be used to pay for more tax breaks for wealthy Americans and large corporations. And here's where I come to what I just don't understand about what's going on in this body. Evidently isn't going on outside America. 60% don't want Medicaid touched, 82% didn't want Medicare touched. Just the fact that it's a majority on Medicaid is amazing and wonderful to me. I don't understand it, Mr. President. I think it's political. I think people know that poor people, the disabled, I run into them often, seek them out sometimes, of the disabled, and they gather in clusters. You see 30 or 50 or 75 people in wheelchairs. What do they depend on? They depend on Medicaid. That's what they depend on. We see them here in the Capitol. Do people stop to see them? Not particularly, no. They know that, so they're not very good lobbyists. They can't be very good lobbyists. It's harder for them to get around. So is it political? I mean, the Ryan budget cuts taxes on the wealthy, on big deal people and big deal corporations by $4 trillion, but cuts Medicaid. Is that an act of social conscience? Is that an act of budget wisdom? Is that a thought-through value system? Or is it just political, basically because they know that poor people don't vote? That's what I think the answer is. Oh, you got worried about Medicare real fast, and we saw the results. We saw the House back off from that completely. Medicaid, not so. And it won't be so unless people start standing up for Medicaid. Because they don't have lobbyists. They can't afford lobbyists. They don't even speak that much for themselves. I don't get as many letters from them by a factor of 10 as I do from Medicare recipients, because there's sort of a sense that life has it in for them. And that's partly an Appalachian characteristic, and I think maybe of many parts of the country, that I've always regretted. A certain fatalism in life, that God has a plan for you, and it isn't necessarily very good. And if people accept that, which I don't as a theory, then they're not going to fight for what Lyndon Johnson gave to the nation and passed overwhelmingly in 1965. Any deep cuts to Medicaid will also, to the pleasure of some, undermine the health care reform law that we just passed, which still is law. Medicaid is the underpinning of the entire coverage expansion and reform. We talk about 32 million people that we're going to cover. That goes way down, Mr. President, if these Medicaid cuts are made. So I ask my colleagues, why is Medicaid so often treated like a second-class program? And more to the point, why are people who are on Medicaid treated so often as second-class people? How does that work out? Is that a product of the American sense of justice? Is that a thoughtful America looking at, you look around you? I have friends, we all have friends who have been on Medicaid, are on Medicaid, were on Medicaid, have made it. Unfortunately, sometimes those people forget their Medicaid background and sort of turn away from that because they're into a new and better life. Somebody has to fight for these people, Mr. President. Somebody has to fight for them. Is it the feeling that maybe they're an unwanted burden on society? We have a tendency in America to say that if you don't work, it's because you don't want to. If you don't have a decent job and you have a shabby home, it's because that's what you sought, not what was given to you in your, at least, destiny of the moment. Again, I think, is it because most of the people enrolled are low income and many typically do not vote? I think that sums it up pretty well. But it's more than that. It's more than that. It's very hard. You can't go into the hollows of Appalachia or Nebraska or other places and organize poor people to vote because their sense is, why? What does it get me? What does it get me? Decade after decade. A little bit is there on the part of the American people a little sense of a disdain towards people on Medicaid, that somehow Medicaid, a glorious program, is an inglorious word when applied to individuals because it implies that they don't want to better themselves. Now, I'm not going to go through my VISTA experience in West Virginia for the 58th time on this floor. But all I can tell you is I saw so many examples of people who were beaten down, not with a cudgel, but they were beaten down because all economic opportunity vanished from their lives. All the coal mines shut down. There weren't any other jobs around. They didn't get to go to school. Why didn't they get to go to school? Because no school bus would come and pick them up because they were too far beyond the end of a hard road, and county law said you don't have to pick them up. You know, the deck stacked against you? Yes, it is. Now, out of that group, there is one. I guess he's a guy about 40. I won't mention his name, but he's got a terrific job. He works with the CSX system as one of their railroad maintenance people. He's got a good family, you know, wonderful, wonderful person. But, you know, his parents were killed in a vehicle crash, and his brothers have been fighting all kinds of problems. So it really takes something special to fight your way out of that self-defined position and make you move forwards. So I must say to my colleagues that the point of a representative democracy is not to serve the few, not even to serve many, but to serve all as best as we can. Does that mean we don't touch anything in Medicaid? No, it doesn't. But does it mean that we keep Medicaid as a safety net? Yes, it does. We're not here elected by some people with incomes above X amount of dollars. We're here by all people, even the people who didn't vote for us or didn't vote at all. I take that very seriously, and I take my my experience in West Virginia very, very seriously. So 68 million people enrolled in Medicaid. I think they deserve a voice in this debate, and I, for one, am going to speak out for them. It's because somehow we feel that Medicaid recipients are not worthy. I've expressed that in a different word. Simply because they have fallen on hard times or they were born in hard times. How do you help that? Your father didn't work, your mother didn't work, there wasn't any work available. So you're born in that situation. What are you going to do about it? You're born in the ghetto. Oh, we'll just rise right above that. Barack Obama did, therefore so can anybody. Life doesn't work like that, and the presiding officer knows that very, very well. Then I must ask of my colleagues, how could this be? We all have neighbors, we have friends, we have family that have or do benefit from Medicaid, even perhaps in their distant past. In fact, nearly half of all Americans have a friend or family member that has received the Medicaid assistance at some point, and they're absolutely worthy of our support. Is it because we believe Medicaid spending is truly out of control? Then I would remind my colleagues that Medicaid costs per beneficiary grew much slower over the past decade than costs for any private health insurance coverage. The administrative costs in Medicaid are about between 1% and 2%. Average health insurance company probably 10, 15, 20%. And all of this despite the fact that Medicaid's more comprehensive benefits are there. They're much larger benefits. They cover more. They do more for people. And significantly lower cost sharing. I fervently believe, Mr. President, that the American tradition of shared responsibility, everybody working together for the greater good, is a tradition worth upholding, and that a government has an ongoing role to play in its preservation. Cannot play that role perfectly, but can do it as best and most fairly as is possible. Instead of shortchanging Medicaid, we must have the courage to rein in tax breaks for corporate America and for people of great wealth. Medicaid does exactly what it was designed to do all those years ago, Mr. President. Provide a safety net for low-income Americans. There are lots of worthwhile and positive ways that we can improve the programs. I grant you that. But trashing Medicaid, gutting Medicaid, and especially if it's sort of flipping it aside or for political gain, cannot be an option. I thank the Chair and I yield the floor.
President. Senator from Iowa.